How do we know the biblical Jesus really existed? It's a question that younger people often have, whether or not they grew up in the church. If they grew up in the church, they may have been raised with stories of Jesus from biblical sources, but then they grow up and they learn that the tooth fairy's not real and Santa's not real and the Easter bunny's not real. By the way, parents, if you had kids listening to this, I'm so sorry. I should have warned you about that. But they listen to all these children's stories and then they think, well, is Jesus real? Or was he just a fairy tale too? Do we know that these happened? And of course, if you've been listening to me for very long in my messages and somewhat in the podcasts, I think we've talked about the different evidence outside the Bible to verify its accuracy for a lot of different things. Today, we're just going to focus on Jesus. Did he really exist? Is there evidence outside of the Bible that proves it? Now, the first thing I want to mention is that all historians, whether Christian or not, agree there was a real historical Jesus of Nazareth. There's an abundance of evidence for that. Some people in the general population may question his existence, but no trained historian questions his existence as a historical person. Then there's question about the story of Jesus, though, what the Bible represents. Did the things in the Bible really happen? Obviously, the biggest one being the resurrection. I'm not going to get into that necessarily today. This question is about the existence of Jesus, not everything he did. But part of our evidence for Jesus' existence has to do with some of the things that he did or was involved in. For instance, one of those is the story of Pontius Pilate. And until a few decades ago, people did not think Pontius Pilate was a real person in the secular world. They thought that he was someone made up as a part of the Jesus narrative. Jesus of Nazareth existed, but Pontius Pilate, there was no evidence for him until 1961, when they discovered what's now called the Pilate inscription. This is a limestone block from 2,000 years ago that mentions Pontius Pilate as the prefect of Judea. And it confirms in the archaeological record that aspect of the biblical account, which is directly a part of the story of Jesus. Now, I should also note that the Bible itself is evidence, not necessarily the English translation that you have, but the thousands of ancient manuscripts that exist in museums and archives around the world that your translation is based on. Those are thousands of old copies of manuscripts that are remarkably similar, very few differences there, an incredible attestation to the historical account of Jesus and the existence of Jesus. Literally thousands of old documents that point to his existence. These are copies of John's manuscript, copies of Mark's manuscript, copies of Matthew's manuscript. They're all remarkably identical. They weren't originally combined into one book, so they're all different eyewitness accounts that claim to be eyewitness accounts of these events. We have more evidence for the historical existence of Jesus than most characters in human history beyond a couple hundred years ago. So those are historical evidence for Jesus, archaeological evidence, these manuscripts for Jesus and the stories about his life. And the fact that those old manuscripts include many unflattering descriptions of the disciples and of the authors of the manuscripts in some cases suggests that these are not made up stories, but real accounts of history, or at least attempts at a real account of history. The fact that the Messiah in them isn't some powerful conquering hero, but a mild, compassionate, and ultimately tortured and killed Messiah also suggests that this is not manufactured for a political movement or a hoax. There are numerous writings from the Apostle Paul that talk about eyewitnesses, not only of Jesus living, but also his death and resurrection. And those old manuscript copies of Paul are also historical evidence. And the fact that they make an effort to point out the eyewitnesses shows that they intend to be taken as history, not mythology or allegory. They're not just some story, at least they claim to be, referring to eyewitness accounts, not just teaching spiritual truths, but accurately recording things that happen. Now, moving outside the biblical manuscripts, the greatest Roman historian, Tacitus, wrote about Jesus being put to death on a cross by Pontius Pilate and said that, quote, a great superstition broke out, unquote, after this. After Jesus' death, a great superstition broke out, which led to Nero eventually persecuting and killing followers of Jesus in all sorts of gruesome ways. That's what Tacitus wrote. So not only does Tacitus confirm that Jesus existed, he confirms the details of his death, that Pontius Pilate was involved, and the persecution of Christians, just as the Bible states. So there's outside biblical evidence. Then we go on the Jewish side. The Jewish historian Josephus writes about Jesus as well. Tacitus wrote a few decades after Jesus, but Josephus was born around the same time that Jesus died. And Josephus wrote that Jesus was a wise man who had many followers among Jews and Greeks. He did amazing feats. Josephus also says that Jesus was condemned to be crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that afterward his followers claim he came back to life, and that a group of people started following him and being called Christians. And then in another writing, Josephus mentions that Jesus says that he was called the Christ and says he had a brother named James. So again, the historical non-Christian writing confirms on the Jewish side and the Roman side the details of the biblical record of Jesus, not just that he existed, but even the details the Bible mentions about him and his death and the claims of resurrection. Josephus, by the way, also mentions John the Baptist and that Herod had him put to death. So there's a lot of corroboration there. There are other old documents from the 1st century that talk about this as well. There's, in not as directive terms, there's a philosopher in Syria that talks about the Jews killing their king, but noting that he lives on because of the new law he brought to people. So that's a very interesting way to put it. Pliny the Younger mentioned that Christians would sing hymns to Christ as someone would to a god. And there are other various references like this to Christ and early Christians who really believed in a literal Jesus Christ. So we have very strong evidence, not only in the Bible, but outside the Bible, for the existence of Jesus. The details about his story, his brother James is being called Christ, his trial with Pontius Pilate, his death by crucifixion, the claim that he rose from the dead, his death sparking a movement that included lots of Jews and Gentiles and didn't die out after that. So yes, there's a lot of evidence for the biblical Jesus in history, even outside the Bible.